is a urban designer, planner, architect, and a conservation advocate. And I know him personally from three aspects, and I want to highlight that. Hi, Soren. I'm just talking about you. See if I get it right. Uh, uh, we first met. It was just before the pandemic, Soren, in February of 2000. Maybe my last public event at your house when I think you talked about the book Walkable City Guide.
Yeah.
That sound right? Yeah,
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
yeah, and that's just right in your lane of things you know so much about, and you've done a whole lot for the city and community with respect to sustainability and accessibility and urban design. The second thing I've know about Soren is that he did some wonderful work on the Jordan River Parkway, which I've taken some long bike rides on about over a dozen times with a group of friends. And gosh, that's a wonderful space, reclaimed from a not so wonderful space. And it's great. And I hope we'll get to hear about that. And so Soren is the executive director of the Jordan River Commission. And the third thing is I'm very aware of what MESA has done as a founding member of Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance, and very active in the C3, the Creation Care Community, Creation Care Community planning and various events we've had together, and done a lot of good work in that regard, and is obviously very well connected with this community and others with regards to the environment, and has done a lot of good for us and continues to do so. Anyway, there's much more I could say, but I think we ought to move on and hear from Soren. We've done introductions otherwise, Soren, so you're on.
Is this where I grab the baton and run?
Please
Okay.
do.
Well, I see some familiar faces and I see some new faces. It's really great to meet some of you and to see many of you again. Thank you for the invitation to join. Is it possible I can share my screen? Whoever's the master with the
Yeah,
technology
let
here.
me get you there. You should be able to now.
There we go. Wonderful. So I'm going to share uh, uh, some slides, and hopefully you can see this okay. Well, so I wanted to just share when Dave asked me to come and join you, he asked me to share a little bit about some of the work that the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance is doing around climate change and public policy, both at the state level and the federal level, which is an important project that we're involved with. But I thought I would maybe, since this is a faith, as I understand it, kind of a faith-based community within Citizen Climate Lobby, if you don't mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that have been drivers for me in how I approach things related to the environment. And I've given this some parts of this presentation before. You might have seen this title, which I did at the Sunstone Symposium, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. Although I'm just using a portion of that. But so you might have seen some parts of this, but hopefully it's valuable to give a little context and some background to what I believe and why I believe. I am an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I work in an appointed position through a framework of political organizations, cities, counties, and state agencies. And so I've been working for many years in this arena of community building, but with this lens of faith. Let me just share with you, kind of some tenets of my faith and my belief that connect to placemaking and to caring for the earth. So many of you who are of the Latter-day Saint faith tradition will recognize this article of faith. We believe in the literal gathering of Israel and the restoration of the 10 tribes, that Zion, or the New Jerusalem, will be built upon the American continent, and that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory. And I want to focus on that last phrase. I think many Christians believe that, after the earth goes through some pretty turbulent times, devastation, that it will somehow magically be renewed. That's not my belief. My belief is that the period that we often refer to as the 1,000 years, the millennium, will be a period that the earth is restored and returned to its glory as it was when it was created. And it's my belief that the devastation that the earth will experience will be at the hand of people. People who have been led astray by all of the things that Jesus Christ, and many church leaders have told us we should avoid. But in fact, I think we are seeing a path that is bringing about great destruction to the earth and many of the systems. And I believe that it will be our role as those who are permitted, allowed, invited to participate during life on the planet, that we will be restoring the earth to the glory that it was when it was created. And so when it's renewed, it will receive its glory, and I believe we will be part of that renewal. And I'll share a little bit more about how I came to that. Let me share with you just, hopefully you'll see some humor in this. I've captured a few ads. I think you'll understand what the intention was when these words were penned that didn't quite come out right. So, sign in a restaurant, open 7 days a week and a weekend. Another restaurant sign: customers who consider a waitress as uncivil ought to see the manager. Sign in a dance hall: good, clean dancing every night but Sunday. A furniture shop ad: our motto is to give our customers the lowest possible prices and workmanship. A used car dealer, and I have to say this a little bit carefully because my brother is a used car dealer: why go anywhere else and be cheated when you can come here? An auto repair service ad: try us once, you'll never go anywhere again. I drove a car kind of like that at one point. Classified ad: a dog for sale, eats anything and is fond of children. So, there's some humor when we say things that don't quite come out right. And the reason I share those is because thinking about the words that we read in our holy scripts have meaning. And sometimes the meaning is hard to understand. Sometimes it's easy to understand. Sometimes we've lost meaning because of translation. So this is, and I'm no expert in Hebrew and Greek, so sometimes it's a little challenging to understand what the meaning was when it's been translated. In our case, it's translated into the King James version of English hundreds of years ago. And King James may have had some of his own reasons for translating things the way that he did. But this is what we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And God blessed them and said to them. So this is following the story of the creation of the earth, living things, plants, animals. This is what he stated at the conclusion of that creative process. And God blessed them, referring to Adam and Eve, and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now, I know many people attribute replenish as being connected to the part about being fruitful and multiplying, which we often talk about as having children and rearing them. I believe that replenish is not necessarily connected in that way. Now, in our Latter-day Saint Book of Scriptures, there is a footnote that references the Hebrew term that replenish comes from, which means to fill. But I believe that there is more meaning to that than just filling the earth with people. I believe that the term replenish means how it was understood at the time of the Old English, and and the roots of the term as it was when other scriptures were created. I'm going to refer to those in a minute. But the verb replenish means to fill something up again, not just to fill something, but to fill it again, or to restore a stock or a supply to a former level or condition. The origins of the word come from Middle English, which means to supply abundantly. Old French meanings lengthened, or again from the Latin terms to fill. So I believe the word in its fullness really means not just to fill something, but to restore it, to renew it, to make it whole again. And that could apply to people, but we know Adam and Eve, as we understand it, were the first people, although we know scientifically there were Homo sapiens before Adam and Eve, at least in the geologic history, compared to the history that we have contained in the Old Testament, which some of our church leaders have talked a little bit about. But whatever the sense is, I don't believe that the term replenish just means to fill the earth with people. That's my belief, and I'm sticking to it. But I'll share with you some reasons that I believe that it doesn't mean that. Now, we as Latter-day Saints also fortunately have two other versions of this creative story. We have in the Pearl of Great Price, the book of Moses. And interestingly, this is virtually identical. The punctuation is slightly different, but this is virtually identical to what we read in Genesis in the King James Version. But interestingly, this is not translated from Hebrew, and the term replenish doesn't have a footnote that means to fill. So be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air. So it's a connective phrase in this version of Moses. Because of the changes in punctuation, it has a slightly different meaning because it connects it all together. As we populate the earth, we're commanded to replenish it and to care for. The term dominion comes from the same root as dominus, which means God. So, in a sense, if you think about what the relationship of God is to the things that he created, he loves them. He created them. He made them beautiful. He made them vibrant. And all of the systems of plants and animals and even the earth itself, which we also learn in Latter-day Saint scripture, have their own spirits. There's the relationship of relative to this root of dominion that I don't believe means to consume it. I believe it means to care for it, to be jointly with our own Creator in caring for the things which He created. Abraham version, which is also in the Pearl of Great Price, has slightly different words. We will bless them, and the God said, we will cause them to be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it. So in my understanding of this, it is in our multiplying and growing as a species that we then take on the accountability to help care for the systems, the life, the habitat, all of the things that work together to create a thriving planet. That is the stewardship that is being outlined here. Not just having children, but having children in the context of caring for all life, caring for all living things, and the systems that sustain us all. Now, there are many other scriptures which connect to this. And, you know, I bring that up in the context because humans were not the only thing that God commanded to multiply, but he used a different terminology when he created the whales and brought forth life in the waters and life in the air. He commanded them also to be fruitful and multiply and fill. This is the verse from Moses. So he commanded living things to multiply and fill the waters and fill the air and fill the earth. But man, he didn't just command to multiply and fill, he commanded us to multiply and replenish, which to me means to renew, continuously renew and restore and keep vibrant the things that sustain life. So, as we think about the meaning of the words and look at individual words and the connection to phrases and connection to whole concepts, this is very much my belief system. Now, the other thing to think about is, what does God think about life itself? We know we know he thinks a lot about the things that he created, but he's also given commandments relative to life. This is the Genesis chapter 9, where he talks about the sanctity of life. And it's not just human life, which we often connect with the sanctity of life, but it's all life. He says, surely your blood of your lives will I require at the hand of every beast will I require it. At the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Then there's the Joseph Smith translation of this same verse, which I'll refer to more holistically. The blood of all flesh which I have given you for meat shall be shed upon the ground, which taketh life thereof, and the blood ye shall not eat. And surely blood shall not be shed only for meat to save your lives, and the blood of every beast will I require at your hands. So there's a lot that I read into these verses. This kind of reinforces what we read about in the Word of Wisdom, that the flesh of animals may be for saving our lives. It is not the primary source of sustenance. Both the Genesis and the Doctrine and Covenants talk about grains and herbs and fruits and vegetables being the primary source of life-giving nutrition. But this last phrase, the blood of every beast will I require at your hands. And that's an interesting concept to think about, because for me, what it means is that it's not just taking the life of an animal. It is the context in which loss of life is sometimes perpetrated in really, really destructive ways. The loss of habitat is a huge destructive force. The ways that we are altering our planet through mining and extraction and industry and other things, the building of our cities in vast, sprawling arrays, has been very damaging to all kinds of life, including our own as people, in ways that I think we will be accountable for. This is from the Doctrine and Covenants. The beasts of the fields and the fowls of the air and that which cometh of the earth is ordained for the use of man, for food and raiment, that he might have an abundance, but is not given that one man should possess that which is above another. Wherefore the world lieth in sin, and woe be unto that man that sheddeth blood, or that wasteth flesh, and hath no need. I believe the ways that we are using the resources of the earth that are destructive are exactly what are being referred to here. And there are other scriptures that reinforce that. This one from Doctrine and Covenant 59. Pleases God that he hath given all these things unto man, for unto this end were they made to be used with judgment, not to excess, neither by extortion. And those terms of excess and extortion, as we relate to the ways that we are damaging the world today, I think are a real condemnation on our many aspects of life. From Doctrine and Covenants, section 104, this is a seminal scripture that many within the environmental faith movement within the Latter-day Saint community have often referred to. That there is an accounting of our stewardship in verse 12 there. Verse 13, I will make every man accountable as a steward over earthly blessings, which I have made and prepared for my creatures, not just for us, but for all creatures. I stretched out the heavens and built the earth, my handiwork, and all things therein are mine. It's my purpose to provide for my saints, for all things are mine, but it must be done in my way. Behold, this is the way that I, the Lord, have decreed, that the poor shall be exalted and the rich are made low. The earth is full and there's enough to spare. I prepared all things and have given them unto the children of men to be agents. Therefore, if any man shall take of the abundance which I have made and impart not his portion according to the law of my gospel to the poor and the needy, he shall with the wicked lift up his eyes in hell, being in torment. And inasmuch as they are faithful, behold, I will bless and multiply blessings upon them. You know, much of the consumer society that we live in today is driven by a desire to have more. And I think that often comes at the expense of this law that God gave us, which is to share together and collectively for not only the good of mankind, but also for the good of all living things. This is one that I've used particularly. This is section 134 in the Doctrine and Covenants. We believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and ministering them for the good and safety of society. We believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. Again, this idea of protecting life as being the reason that governments exist. And it's not just our lives as humans, it is in the context of all of these scriptures. It is the context of protecting all life and the systems that support life. So I share this with you to give you some of my background as a student of the law. Now, I want to share with you just a few statements that reinforce this from leaders of our faith. Brigham Young talks about the gathering of the saints in the Salt Lake Valley, which is where I live. Do not suffer the soil, the air, and the water to become polluted. They're pure, they're healthy. That's a pretty direct statement. Spencer W. Kimball spoke a lot about the environment. We recommend all people that there be no undue pollution, that the land be taken care of and kept clean to be productive and beautiful. Ezra Taft Benson, some of you know, was both a church leader and a political leader. Although I don't subscribe to all of his political movements and actions, he made some really powerful statements about caring for the earth. We're stewards over the earth. We have limited soil and water, which was given to us. There's no moral latitude, he says. We have to turn the land over, not drained of fertility and other resources, but improved in its quality and its productivity and its usefulness for future generations. Pollution of one's environment and moral impurity both rest on a lifestyle which partakes of a philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry, gouge and grab, no regard for consequences. This violates the spirit of stewardship, which we stand accountable. So again, there's often accountability with stewardship. Spencer W. Kimball also said, talking about his travels around the earth, which became very extensive, particularly during his presidency, where air flight and other travel made it easy to survey the earth. And he talks about, viewing the countryside from his travels and feeling that the earth can hardly bear our presence. The pollution of mind and body and the surroundings. Recently, Sharon Eubanks spoke at Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship. She spoke at several events, but she spoke in one where she talked about wasting the resources of the earth. When we waste what others desperately need, what are the ramifications to our physical hearts and our unity? This is a difficult question for people who live in what we call first world countries, because it's almost impossible not to waste things. Yet our Lord and God, as the creator, wastes nothing. His system has no waste. When we waste what others desperately need, what does that do to the fabric that stretches between us as human beings? This ties to those scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants and the creation story itself. I think many of us are familiar with the talk given in 2000 at the turn of the millennium by then Apostle Russell M. Nelson. As beneficiaries of the divine creation, what shall we do? We should care for the earth, be wise stewards over it, and preserve it for future generations, and to love and care for one another. Incidentally, some of you who may be familiar with the church handbook may have noted that there was a brand new section just added recently about caring for creation, and it uses this very quote from President Nelson. Now, this is the one that I am particularly interested in seeing what happens. President Oaks was sustained as prophet and the president of the church just a few months ago. This was an interesting and I think prophetic talk that he gave back in 2017 to the students at BYU, Brigham Young University, Hawaii, as the part of his commencement address. Now, it wasn't to talk about the environment, but I thought this was a really way for him to begin his talk. These are challenging times filled with big worries, wars and rumors of wars, possible epidemics of infectious diseases, droughts, floods, and global warming. This was in 2017. What's happened since 2017? Oh my goodness. Seacoast cities are concerned with the rising level of the ocean, which will bring ocean tides to their doorsteps or over their thresholds. Global warming is also affecting agriculture and wildlife. Notice he connects again global warming and what we're doing to the atmosphere of our planet to all living things, including wildlife. Nations whose prosperity depends on world peace and free trade worry about disturbing developments that threaten either or both of these. We're even challenged by the politics of conflict and the uncertainties sponsored by the aggressive new presidential administration in the world's most powerful nation. Of course, we're in version 2 of that now, and we're seeing such devastating consequences from the current Trump administration that's rolling back so much, going back 40 or 50 years of environmental protection in the name of greed and aggressive consumption and things like that. Certainly, those that participate in this kind of lifestyle that we're witnessing unfold will be accountable for the damage to humanity and to the planet. So how are we doing with our collective stewardship? I'll just reference some things. I won't read through all of these. You can read them yourself on the screen. Some really challenging things happening with our land. New deserts, shrinking forests, losing loss of food producing land, erosion, and the things that support agriculture and livestock are all being threatened. What's happening to our water? This picture, by the way, in the background is the Jordan River where I work. If any of you are ever interested in paddling the Jordan River, I'd love you to see what's happening with our watershed as we collect stormwater around our valley through amazing feats of engineering. We haven't solved the problem of how to keep all of the stuff that washes off our roads and our parking lots and our streets into our rivers and streams and lakes. And the consequences are becoming really, really devastating. Utah Lake and Jordan River and others are certainly suffering from that. We're losing our underground water tables. We have lots of contamination, chemical contamination, litter contamination, nutrient contamination. The harmful algal bloom we saw in Utah Lake last year was the worst one possibly that we've ever seen. And a lot of that's coming from stormwater contamination. Then, of course, 2021, this is outdated. 2022 was the next greatest recorded low level of Great Salt Lake, and many are concerned that this year will set yet another record low of Great Salt Lake. What's happening in our atmosphere? That's I think something that we're all interested for sure. Carbon dioxide, methane, sea level increases, devastating wildfires. 2021, which is when I produced this, was the hottest year on record. Of course, we've set 3 more records since 2021, including the last 2 years consecutively. And for those of you in Utah right now, we're experiencing just an unprecedented winter with very little moisture and unseasonably spring-like temperatures through much of the winter. What's happening with our wildlife? This is one that I'm particularly connected to and doing a lot of work around right now. Bird populations in North America have declined by almost 30% since 1970. Now, this is a report that's about 4 or 5 years old now. Some species by more than 50%. Global wildlife populations have declined by 68% over the last 50 years, largely due to human activity. Extinction of plant and animal species are estimated at 140 daily, and 1/5 of all species may disappear over the next 20 years. You think about the story, which for those of you who are following Come Follow Me in our Latter-day Saint Sunday school programs, we just studied the story of Noah and the great care that Noah went to save animals, and yet what we're seeing today happening on our planet of the what I believe is really the great decimation of animal life, and even some plant life, which is going through extinction level events, is pretty concerning. So it's a rough picture, and if we believe the scriptures, it's not going to get better until it gets worse for a period. But I believe that we, among all the people that are believers in a God and a creator and a destiny for being stewards of the creation, we have both individual and collective responsibilities. And so, what can we do? That's what I want to focus on. I'm going to share just a little bit. Some of you are familiar with Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship and Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. These were both projects that I've been heavily involved with over the last 15 years, starting when I was working on my master's degree at Westminster University here in Salt Lake City. The formation of Latter-day Saint Stewardship was actually a project of one of my classes in my master's program at Westminster. We had a group that was working and gathering. We were coming out of the 2008 presidency when we had some prominent Latter-day Saints starting to express interest. That culminated in 2012 with both John Huntsman Jr. and Mitt Romney being high profile. We had Harry Reid as the leader, the president of the Senate at the time. So we had very prominent members of our faith in both the Democratic and the Republican Party at the time. And out of that context, there were a lot of us that were thinking, we have some polar opposite conversations going on about what it means to have a relationship with the environment. This was coming off the Republican platform of Drill Baby Drill, which we're hearing very much today. And prominent Latter-day Saints who are members of a party that is the party of Drill Baby Drill, is that really the value that we believe is our relationship? So out of that conversation and those discussions, this very prominent Mormon moment, if you will, with many political leaders that we share a faith with, Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship grew out of that moment in 2010, 2011, 2012. We incorporated as a nonprofit organization. I wrote the nonprofit application and the letter and carried forward the articles of organization to the state of Utah that created the nonprofit organization now known as Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship, and was on their board for many years. During that time, in the early movement of that movement, to try and reconnect Latter-day Saints with this enormous volume of scripture and prophetic statements by church leaders, men and women. We had, Sharon Eubank, who was a leader of the humanitarian programs, the president of humanitarian programs for the church, talking about climate change and environmental catastrophes, creating the largest migrations that we've ever seen in human history in terms of the number of people that are being displaced. And then, a lot of folks were really interested in getting more engaged in the conversation around climate change. And at the time, Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship wanted to focus more on individual, kind of responsibility and not take on politically challenging topics like climate change. And so there were a group of us that branched out of Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship and created MESA, or the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance, specifically to begin having dialogue with our faith affiliated political leaders at the federal level, at the state level, in many Western states that have large Latter-day Saint populations, at the local government level. There are many leaders, political leaders, who are members of our faith, some of whom espouse a strong ethic around caring for the environment, but many who hold a party platform much higher than their religious values and beliefs. And so we said we need to bring into these political conversations a healthy dose of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint in these politically fraught times. And that's really the environment that MESA was created in. So we've been involved. We're still very much a fledgling organization. We've been around for just a little over a decade. MESA was formed in 2014 formally. We had our first meetings in 2013, but we became a nonprofit organization in 2014. And since then, we've been involved in some major movements. One of these is called the Climate Action Campaign. This is a affiliation of organizations nationally that has been really pushing for climate change. We were very involved in some of the major policies that made their way through Congress, particularly during the Biden-Harris administration. Things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Jobs and Infrastructure Act that Mitt Romney was very involved with. We had many conversations with Romney's staff and encouraged him to keep pushing. We tried to get more of our political leaders in Utah to support some of these bills. And unfortunately, the Inflation Reduction Act, with many of the methane regulations that are now in place and other pollution prevention from carbon dioxide, we had no support from our Utah delegation or from any of the Latter-day Saints serving in Congress. So even though we were happy to see communities with large Latter-day Saint populations being benefited from these, we were really discouraged not to see any support from Latter-day Saint leaders in Congress support these initiatives. And we've done some accountability work with them. I happen to go to church with Blake Moore, the current District 1 representative. He's a neighbor of mine, a great man, a real family man. I'm trying to encourage him to be more active on environmental issues and to really be, he's made some statements that suggest he might be a leader on climate change. We haven't really seen that yet. Same thing with John Curtis, who I worked with. He was a client of mine when I was practicing architecture and city planning many years ago, and had hoped to see him take a much greater stand. But so far, the words have been louder than their actions. One of the projects that we're working on right now, and I'm just sharing you with some handouts, on the left is part of a survey that we were involved with doing back in early 2025. And this survey was released just about the time of the transition from the Biden to the Trump administration. It came out, I think, on January 26th or 27th of last year. It was an extensive survey we did with some partners that are part of what we call a Utah Methane Coalition. And we we shared this with the editorial boards of both the Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune. We had hoped to see some coverage of this, but there was so much happening in the state legislature last year, and with the transition to the Trump administration, it was hard to get any oxygen to shed light on this. So we've tried to find other ways to share it, including at the Conservative Climate Summit that Senator Curtis has held for many years, both when he was in the House and now in the Senate. But when we talk about support for stronger regulations around methane specifically, this is what our survey showed. We surveyed, I think we had about 500 or 600 people that were surveyed. You'll see here strong across the state, strong support for methane regulation, 69%, 30% opposed. And then we looked at it by party affiliation. Even among the GOP, we see 60% total support and 26% strong support for additional methane regulations. And this includes things like capturing emissions from, particularly from oil and gas industry, which is a very large industry in eastern Utah. And a big reason why eastern Utah is no longer in attainment for clean air standards under the Clean Air Act is because of ozone and methane coming from extractive industries there. There is some new work happening with a partner of ours, the Environmental Defense Fund, which has for several years both been doing flyovers with aircraft and more recently satellite imagery that shows the level of emissions coming from, this is the Uinta Basin. You can see Colorado, Wyoming, Utah here. This is right over Vernal in the Uinta Basin area. And you can see the level of emissions that settle in the valley coming from oil and gas industry, mostly leakage from old wells or leaks in even more modern equipment. This is what a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act methane measures were tackling, and the Biden administration passed the methane rule that requires that more of the methane that's leaking into the atmosphere be captured and either used as a commodity or removed so it's not a pollutant. It's many times more impactful to climate change than carbon dioxide. Even though it's a much smaller pollutant, it's one that has enormous impact. It is the reason that for the last two climate summits internationally, the last 2 years, that methane emissions have been a major focus, predominantly from the oil and gas industry, but also from waste supplies and from agriculture, which also produce large amounts of methane. The reduction of permafrost in the boreal forests in the very far north reaches of Europe and North America and Asia are also producing enormous amounts of methane, which are likely to increase as climate change warms those areas. So methane is a really significant contributor, and in the coming years, more likely to do more harm in connection with climate change than carbon dioxide is. This was an interesting commentary right after Senator Curtis. These were posters that we put up during the Conservative Climate Summit last fall as part of our work with Senator Curtis's office. They invited us to come, and we were hoping to do a presentation on methane. We weren't successful. We're trying again this year at the next Conservative Climate Summit to have more of a focus on methane. But this was an interesting commentary from Senator Curtis when he was on Radio West on our local public radio station just shortly after he was sworn in as a new senator. He said, fossil fuels don't cause climate change, emissions cause climate change. So let's change the conversation from fossil fuels to emissions. I think we generally agree that it is the emissions from fossil fuels that are largely problematic. He talks about, needing to be part of the conversation. We continue to work closely through MESA and other partners with Senator Curtis's office. We've even talked about maybe helping to develop some legislation that he could sponsor in the Senate that would maybe revisit the topic of methane, which has come under a lot of criticism. It's still a focus because it was part of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's hard for the administration to completely erase methane programs. They've, at this point, just delayed their implementation by a couple of years. But it would be difficult without an act of Congress to completely reverse what's going on. On the right is my own Congressman, Blake Moore, and my neighbor. He says the GOP needs to change the narrative as the United States explores ways to lower carbon emissions. Our environment is paramount. I want to be sure the Republican Party has a seat at the table. The long-term health and viability of our planet is a goal we all have to share. So, we are hearing some positive. We know we have some legislators from Utah who are Latter-day Saints that have bought into the climate hoax and are using that language. Senator Lee and Congressman Owens have been particularly damaging on the climate change front. Although we are trying to have those conversations with their staff and with them, we're putting a lot more faith and hope in these others, Senator Curtis and Congressman Moore, and have been in really active dialogues with their staff and with them. I share again the commentary from President Oaks and this one from Sharon Eubank when she was in the General Relief Society president. This was part of a forum that Latter-day Saint Earth Stewardship hosted in 2019, where she talks about the impacts of climate change and the work that the church is increasingly doing with their humanitarian programs in response. Now, I'm feeling probably more optimistic than ever given the strong statement by President Oaks in 2017 that we may actually see from President Oaks and the time that he has the mantle, maybe some greater focus. I'm not overly optimistic that we'll get a statement like Pope Francis back in 2015 with the encyclical on climate change and caring for creation. But President Oaks' statement in 2017 gives me some optimism that maybe he could help move the needle, particularly among the Latter-day Saints, and to have a statement around climate change by President Oaks. So we're actively trying to push for that, meeting with members of the employees of the church system within the presiding bishop's office and others to encourage just continued dialogue. We did have some conversations with some of them when Catherine Hayhoe was here several years ago. We met with several high-level church officers, men and women, who are actively involved in public affairs for the church and things like that, where we said very directly, and President Hinckley, not President Gordon Hinckley, but his son, who was in the presidency of the 70 at the time, did say, keep doing what you're doing. We need to hear from you. We need to hear about these things. So that was a really encouraging conversation with Catherine Hayhoe, where some church leaders were encouraging us to continue to do this, to have these conversations around these really important environmental topics. I'm going to just wrap up and just share kind of my personal path. So some of my work in environment, which is not just the advocacy work that I've done as an elected official on the Salt Lake City Council and through the advocacy I worked through LDS or Stewardship and MESA. But really, I've developed an ethic around caring for the earth that started with this trip to the Boundary Waters in the early 1980s when I was a Boy Scout. My father was our scoutmaster. We drove from Austin straight up Interstate 35 till it ended in the Twin Cities, and then went a little bit further right up to the Boundary Waters of northern Minnesota. And we left our base camp and started paddling across the first lake, and we had our canoes loaded up. And I looked over at our guide who was with us, who was in a canoe right next to mine. I said, we didn't bring any water. We had some water purification, but I'm like, it'll take a long time to purify all the water. He dipped his cup in the lake and took a drink and said, we have all the clean, pure water we need. And it blew my mind that there was water like that on the earth because it's not the kind of water that I experienced in Central Texas and what we see here in Utah, water that's contaminated, unfortunately, from a lot of human activity. But that blew my mind. And that was really in my youth experiences, one of the really pivotal moments that said, what if we could care for the earth in a way that we could go to any body of water and drink from it, like people used to do. I studied architecture and city planning and urban design at the University of Texas when the Biosphere 2 project was going on in Arizona. So I remember a lot of the publicity around this. I was very active in some early climate change conversations going on in the architecture program and the planning school at the University of Texas, while a lot of this was going on, and kind of understanding that the earth provides a healthy ecosystem for all living things, including humans. But if we don't care for it, we saw what happened with the Biosphere 2 project, which ended short because they couldn't sustain a closed system for more than 17 months. I'm a big believer that among all the people on the earth, Latter-day Saints should have an understanding and tools and resources at our fingertips to help us become advocates. When I was studying architecture and planning at the University of Texas, it was a Japanese planner who taught a planning class that I took that really introduced me to the Plat of Zion. I'm like, how have I been a Latter-day Saint for, I was a returned missionary at this point. How have I been a Latter-day Saint for 25 years and really don't know anything about the Plat of Zion, which settled over 750 communities, which was recognized in the 1990s as one of the most significant colonizing efforts of city building and city planning in the history of human beings. I'm like, how do I not know about this? And what's remarkable is what's contained in the Plat of Zion. And this is a whole nother lecture I could go into, but the Plat of Zion, 1 square mile, the remarkable thing about this is that Joseph Smith envisioned people living in compact, walkable communities. There's been a lot of brouhaha about 15-minute cities when the Point development, which is the old prison site in Utah, was being developed as a 15-minute city. And there were all kind of conspiracy theories that, this is a United Nations conspiracy to take away our rights as human beings. And I'm like, Joseph Smith designed a 10-minute city, which he received by revelation, and it was used to settle 750 colonies of the Mormon pioneers in the Western United States or Western North America, from Mexico to Canada. It talks about 20,000 people living in 1 square mile. There's only 4 cities in the United States that have population densities in small areas that reach 20,000 people in 1 square mile. That's a remarkable thing. Everything was within walking distance, everything that you needed to sustain life, to sustain a village. It was a plan focused on communal living, not isolationist kind of living. When we talk about, the rugged individual in the West, I say that is so much baloney, because the West was settled by the Mormon pioneers building communities that could collectively gather people into villages of 20,000 people in 1 square mile with everything that they needed within a 5 to 10-minute walk. Talk about, a vision for walkable communities. It's really remarkable. So I've tried to take some of what I learned about walkable communities from the Plat of Zion when I was studying at the University of Texas, not from my faith leaders, but from a planner from Japan. And I've tried to institute that. I did a lot of work on the city council to create walkable city policies, complete streets, walkable zoning reform, creating trails. We expanded the trail network and pedestrian and bike network in Salt Lake by 120 miles. In the 8 years I was on the city council, we created streetcars and public transit expansion. But the corollary to that is what we're seeing happen right now, and that is the development of really sensitive areas. The development of the inland port in Salt Lake, which continues, is threatening some of our most sensitive wildlife habitat in the entire region. We tend to think of our forests and the mountains as being sensitive, but the wildlife habitat around Great Salt Lake and Great Salt Lake, we're focusing a lot on the saline lake part of it, declining water levels and what dust pollution means and everything else. But it's the freshwater bodies, which is wetlands and playas and uplands and all of these areas that are fed by the large tributaries, Bear River, Weber River, Jordan River. Climate change is exacerbating the problems we're going to see with water. A lot of our water problems right now are because we're consuming too much water, and we want the desert to blossom as a rose, but we're not growing blossoms and roses. We're growing turf. And that's not what we should be watering. We should be using water with the scarcity that it really has. So, I encourage people to get involved, not just with the saline lake, but also the freshwater bodies and the connected upland and habitat areas, the ephemeral water bodies around the lake that are also being devastated by climate change. The heat is affecting wildlife. The loss of water is affecting our snowpack, which is affecting our runoff, which is affecting the available water to replenish the saline lake and all of the shorelands that sustain millions and millions of birds. The exact bird populations that are declining because of climate change and excessive water use. I went through kind of this transformation. I talked about the experience I had in Minnesota. The second experience I had was in 2017. I was visiting Nicaragua as part of a State Department exchange program. I hosted a young entrepreneur and architect from Nicaragua for 3 months in Salt Lake City back in 2016, and then was invited to participate in a 2-week exchange to visit Nicaragua. And as part of that excursion, I had a chance to visit an estuary preserve and restoration site. And this was remarkable, recapturing and replenishing sea turtle habitat and bird and fish and aquatic wildlife habitat, kind of all collectively under this Juan Venado Island Nature Preserve. And that was another really transformational moment for me. And I said, I'd been doing a lot of planning work up to that point around the Jordan River. I was serving on the board of directors for the Jordan River Commission at the time. And I said, you know what? We need to be doing this kind of work with our Jordan River and with our Utah Lake and with the shorelands of our Great Salt Lake. So I came back, made a career choice. I was going to leave the board of the Jordan River Commission and applied to become a member of the staff and executive director. And that's what I've been doing for the last almost 9 years. But it's all interconnected. And this goes back to what I shared at the very beginning. We have a stewardship not only to care for each other, but to care for all living things. And if anybody's ever interested in getting into the Jordan River and seeing what climate change and pollution and environmental degradation is doing to our water bodies that supply the shorelands of Great Salt Lake, I'm happy to take you on a tour and share with you, the impacts to land, air, and atmosphere. I mean, land, water, and atmosphere that you really see coalesce around the Jordan River in many ways. I'd be happy to share an experience. I'll just share this as a closing. I'm always looking for ways. A friend of mine and I, about 15 years ago, launched a business called Strategy. We both have other careers, and so this has never been a major opportunity. But we about 2 years ago finished a project. This is a carbon sequestering building. And this building, interestingly enough, is about the size of the buildings that Joseph Smith drew on the Plat of Zion. It's a 650-foot building, 2 stories, on about a 300-foot footprint. It was located in the backyard of my friend Susan Klinker, who was the designer and instigator of this project. I was a supporter on the design and development of it. But this is an accessory unit behind her home in the Sugar House area of Salt Lake. And it was completed a couple of years ago. It is a building that uses as many natural building products as possible: wood, straw as the insulation, plaster for the walls, wall finishes on the interiors. These are all natural products. They have a very low carbon footprint. The only really carbon producing material was the glass in the windows and the concrete in the foundation. And even the concrete in the foundation used fly ash and things like that, which are waste byproducts, in order to sequester carbon. So this structure, including its design, its construction, the materials that go into it, and its ongoing operation, is a net sequester of carbon, meaning this building doesn't produce carbon, it sequesters carbon, and it has a net zero, negative net zero total footprint in terms of carbon production. A lot of net zero tends to refer to the energy that buildings consume. This is one of the first buildings in the US that went through an entire building process certification program that looks at the entire carbon footprint of the building, from transportation of materials to the development and installation of materials, and then the way that it uses energy and other things going forward. It has a very low energy consumption and photovoltaics on the rooftop. But we even did the carbon footprint for the photovoltaic panels on the rooftop and everything else. So it is a carbon sequestering building, and we hope that this will become a model. We're actually working on a second one at the Other Side Village, which is a project in development. A one-story version of this, a slightly larger footprint, but a smaller structure. It's only about 400 square feet total. So, just finding ways that we can continue to build compact, to use resources wisely, especially using resources in ways that are renewable. And with that, I'll just leave you with this final slide. There is divine purpose in caring for creation, consecrating our efforts to the conservation and restoration of our land, water, atmosphere, and wildlife, and caring for each other. This is my reflection on President Nelson's statement and what really is a driver in the work that I do, both personally and professionally, in my family and my community. So I'm happy to share some of what I've been doing with you. I'd be happy. I know we're about out of time, so I don't know if we have time for questions, but I hope this has been maybe a little inspiring, maybe some ideas, maybe some ways to be catalysts in your own right. I don't know many of you already are, but hopefully there's something here that might support the work that you're doing. Thank you for letting me come share my world with you.
Great, Soren. Fantastic. I like it that you didn't pull your punches. You're kind of telling it like it is there. It's good.
Well, we
Comments?
should tell the truth, right?
Yes. Think about that. Yeah. Comments, questions. Somebody asked about the slides. Karen wants to know if those are available.
I'd be happy to share them with Dave and Tom, and if you want to distribute them. Yeah.
That was great. I sense we just scratched the surface. Soren, so much more to talk about. Indeed.
I think Phil's got it. Phil, jump in.
Yeah, Soren, one question, we've talked quite a bit in this group about how meanings and use of words tend to either include or exclude members of the church. And we've talked about how sometimes you can phrase things a different way and the member of the church will say, oh, I love that. But had you talked about climate change or something else, they were against it. I'm just wondering your response and that kind of thing.
Well, I've had the fortunate opportunity to meet several times with Catherine Hayhoe, both, within the Creation Care Coalition. We invited her as a speaker, but I visited with leaders of the church, with the editorial board for all of the Bonneville communication companies. And she doesn't mince words, and she was a real strength for me. It was right around the first time I met her was right around the same time as Pope Francis's encyclical. And I said, if the leader of the largest religious movement in the world can talk openly about climate change, and then, Catherine Hayhoe is just an expert at just find ways to talk about it, find common ground, but don't shy away from talking about it. Not everybody will believe, but not talking about it is not a solution. The solutions start with having those conversations. I've actually been an adjunct professor at the University of Utah in the planning department for a few years, and I taught a couple of classes recently. And I actually shared the TED Talk that Catherine Hayhoe gave with the class. And I gave them the assignment to pick 5 people born in 5 different decades, and not family members or members of your household like a roommate, and have a conversation and find some common ground. And we had, I think, 35 kids in the class. Not one of them had any difficulty finding ways to talk about climate change and find some common ground, even with people that were skeptical. So, I'm a big believer in the, Catherine Hayhoe's book, Saving Us, that we have to talk about things that are important, even if they're hard conversations. And we have to demonstrate by our actions that we actually believe what we're saying. And that's been a driver for me. I know they're tired of hearing me talk about climate change in my ward. But, I have a whole talk. I gave a Sunday school lesson on Section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which I think very specifically references climate change. And it talks about teach ye the doctrines of the kingdom. And we usually just use that phrase in isolation. Well, the next 2 verses talk about what the doctrines of the kingdom are. They're the natural sciences. They're the social sciences, talking about history, talking about the future. All of these things are doctrines of the kingdom. It doesn't stop at, our religious conversations. It's all of the things that relate to the earth. What's above the earth, what's on the earth, what's under the earth, things that are to come. A lot of climate change conversation is about the future, and Doctrine and Covenants 88 says we need to be talking about the future and what's coming. So I use these things to have those conversations. And anyway, there are ways to have them. You just have to keep pushing.
Excellent. Got to jump off, Soren, but thank you so much.
Dave and Tom both know how to reach me. If anybody wants to follow up, I'm happy to, have some offline conversations by email, by text, or, feel free to pick up the phone and call me as well.
Looking forward to a bike ride on the Jordan River.
Let's go do it soon.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be 80,
Sorry.
80 something tomorrow. Oh my goodness. Where did we just skipped spring?
Yeah. Let's let it cool down.
Skip the winter.
Well, thank you all for the work that you're doing. I know if you're here, you're an advocate. So hopefully I've given you
Thank you.
Thanks,
some
Soren.
fodder and some words to inspire your activism. Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Let's keep
It was
going.
great.